My countrymen, as of the 21st of this month, I signed Proclamation number 1081, placing the entire Philippines under martial law. This proclamation was to be implemented upon my clearance, and clearance was granted at 9 o'clock in the evening of the 22nd, last night. I have proclaimed martial law in accordance with the powers vested in the President by the Constitution of the Philippines. The proclamation of martial law is not a military takeover. I, as your duly elected President of the Republic, use this power, which may be implemented by the military authorities, but still is a power embodied in the Constitution to protect the Republic of the Philippines and our democracy.
Hello, I'm Mass Formatic for TCRN, Trivium, Cafe, Radio Network.com. The interview you're about to hear is with Mr. Art Reyes, a former citizen of the Philippines at the time when President Ferdinand Marcos declared martial law. Mr. Reyes has been kind and informative in taking the time to speak with me, sharing his story, experience, knowledge, and understanding on martial law. This is where we start the conversation. We don't end it.
Mr. Art Reyes, thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to speak with me and for sharing your knowledge and understanding on martial law. Real important topic. First question, right off the bat, I guess, would be, what is martial law?
In my opinion, martial law is when the government takes over and basically removes all democratic functions, and the government becomes a dictator. And basically they take away a lot of people's rights, and that's what happens. They dictate everything. Okay? That's my understanding of what martial law is. And of course, martial meaning it's also the military is involved, because they're the ones who will be enforcing what the government or what the dictator wants, basically.
Right.
Okay?
And in your time in the Philippines, what was your experience with martial law?
Well, I wasn't involved too much with, I was working for the government, but my experience with martial law basically is just that, what they call this now, when it was declared, the very first day it was declared, a lot of government offices were closed, post offices were closed, television stations were closed, telecommunications stations were closed, and even and everywhere else, especially the post office, there were soldiers surrounding the post office. There were soldiers surrounding the radio stations and the TV stations, and of course the government offices. And nobody knew what was going on until the announcement was made right around midday.
And was that the big announcement, September 23rd, 1972, when Ferdinand Marcos declared martial law officially?
Yes, basically. It all started with when I woke up that morning, radios were on, and there was nothing on the radio but music. No commercials, no talks, nothing. Television stations were the same way. All they were showing was movies after movies after movies, no commercials, nothing. And every now and then, every hour or so, there was an announcement being made so that please stand. The announcement was like, please stand by for an important announcement by the President of the Philippines. And so around noon, the announcement came. The President came on TV and on radio, announcing that martial law was being declared for the good of the country. Is how they worded it, basically. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I saw the YouTube clip.
Yeah. Okay. So that's what my experience was, and then of course that day curfew hours were what do you call this now, was started. On the very first day, nobody was allowed after 6 o'clock p.m. in the streets. If you were not in your house, you will be arrested. And then a lot of organizations like the Rotary Club, the Lions Club, the JCs were not allowed to hold their weekly meetings. And gathering of more than 20 people at one time, at one shot, was disallowed unless you get permission from the government. I was getting married that year in November, and I had to ask permission to hold the wedding from the government. And that's what martial law is all about.
Wow.
Yeah.
And what was your initial reaction when you first found out?
Well, it was more like surprise, really. Although a lot of people like myself, we had an inkling that something was going on, because there was a lot of, prior to martial law being declared, maybe I don't know how many months, there was a lot of riots, demonstrations, rallies against the government, and government quelling these rallies and all this stuff. Some of them, they said that it was communist inspired. Some of them was just like radical students or something like that, blah, 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 so on. But in the end, it comes out that all of these rallies and demonstrations were staged by the government themselves in order to give them the reason to declare martial law.
An organized event.
And organized, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and I see a lot of that in history, but this is no different with Ferdinand Marcos and the government at the time.
Marcos, let's put it this way. Marcos was a very smart man. He is a very intelligent lawyer. So you can't put it past him.
You're right. And how did martial law affect the systems of A, the economy, B, transportation, and C, communication?
Communication, I think, was the one that was mostly affected, because then at that point they controlled radio, they controlled television, they controlled even the post offices. Transportation, it was probably close to normal, except that checkpoints were set up. And as far as, what was the other one?
Economy.
The economy, yeah, they got a hold of the economy a little bit. I don't quite remember what it did to the economy at that time, but yeah, it was like anything else. Whether or not martial law was declared, the economy was still moving, people were still buying things, stuff. But again, it's controlled. Yeah.
So if individuals have to ask permission for certain events or gatherings,
Yeah.
Was there any private ownership of business or property, or was this allowed?
Oh yeah. No. The private business and property is still there. You still own your house. You still own this thing, but again, it's more like I said, government controlling everything that your movements, your activities, everything was all controlled. There was no elections. Okay. Whenever there were so-called elections, for instance, it was more like a gathering of people, and they say, this is the guy that we want to put in here, this is the other guy, who's for this guy, and there was no voting. It was all raise your hand for aye or raise your or nay, that kind of thing. And they were gathering people in groups to do that.
And how was the opposition to martial law handled by the government, and particularly journalists, press?
They were arrested. Anybody who spoke against the government was arrested in the guise of being invited for questionings. I know a couple of friends of mine who were very active in against the government, and one day, his name was Ben. I still remember that. He was my classmate in graduate school. One day he came to my house. He said, my girlfriend and I have some problems. Can we come to your house and discuss our problems? And I said, sure, no problem. That was my friend. So they came to the house, they talked. I left them alone, and then they said goodbye. And then one day he disappeared. Nowhere to be heard from again. And I said, oh, well. And at that point, I found out that they came to my house because they were planning their escape. And then 6 months later, or maybe 7 months later, he showed up. Not saying a word, couldn't speak anything, don't want to talk about anything. He didn't want to talk about where he was or what happened. We found out later that he was arrested and put in jail and tortured. And that's what happened to him.
And you know anything else about kidnappings, assassinations?
I'm sure there were some of that happening, but what they call it now, it was always hush-hush. You hear about it, but you never know who instigated it, who was the one in charge of it, something like that. You'll never know, and you will never be able to prove it.
Right.
Yeah, it's the same thing, Yeah, we know one congressman who was assassinated in church. He was Catholic. Philippines is a Catholic society, and he was in church on a Sunday morning. He was taking communion. So he was kneeling down in front of the altar with people right behind him, and two people came up, plugged the bullet right behind in the back of his head. The whole church panicked and scattered. Those two were never found again.
Wow.
But that's what, and they never knew who did it or who ordered it.
Right.
Yeah. That was one of the things in martial law. If you oppose the government, they can do that to you with no qualms about it.
How did martial law directly affect your community?
Not, I guess in terms of your daily activity, it wasn't that bad. You were still going to work, you were still going to your restaurant, having your beer, whatever. You still went to the movies, but again, everything is like controlled. Like after a few months, I think it must be 3 months or 6 months of martial law, from the day martial was started. They lifted the curfew instead of at 6 o'clock in the evening. They now put it up at about 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening, to like 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock in the morning. And that was the curfew hours. If you're caught in between those hours, you are put to jail. But then they lifted it a little bit, so they eased it up a little bit.
Right.
That's about it.
And you mentioned before there was some signs or signs of a build-up to this event, and what in particularly were the signs? You mentioned political rallies and demonstrations, and it's kind of an organized event, but in regards to the social upheaval, political turmoil, you definitely saw signs and things leading up to this.
Like I said, the demonstrations, mostly by students, was always there. So it was almost like a weekly thing, and the government would blame it on unrest on some sectors of society. The government would blame it on communism, and the government would blame it on something else. But it was always like that. And then, of course, we were at that point, the Philippines was still a democratic society, but the guy who was in power, President Marcos, engineered it so he could hold it. He got a hold of the military. The Secretary of Defense was involved in it. Everything. So they all planned it. So as far as science is concerned, you will see things that are not normal. Basically, like I said, more of these demonstrations, more government control of things, and that kind of thing. I mean, it's very subtle, and then boom, it's there.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and how was this justified? I mean, just to let the listeners know, how was this justified by the Marcos government?
It was justified in terms of like saying it's for the good of the country, to take control of what's going on, to quell the so-called radical movement, to quell the so-called insurrection. That was the justification for this whole thing, basically. And the only way to justify that is get control of everything. Is what it is. Police, soldiers, everything was controlled. Even government offices were controlled.
Right.
Yeah.
And you mentioned curfews and checkpoints before. Was this something that would heavily thwart your day-to-day activities?
Well, you just have to watch out.
You just have to watch
out that you don't venture out after hours. We did that one time. It was a funny incident because we were in a bar having our drinks. It was a Friday afternoon, and we forgot the time. And by the time we realized that it was too late, the owner closed the bar and let us stay inside the bar. But soldiers wised up. They saw the cars outside the bar. They knocked on the door. We were all hauled out to the camp and had to stay overnight. Those were one of the things that I experienced there.
What, please extrapolate on that. What was that like?
Oh, it was to us, because we were having a good time and all that stuff. It was like, and we were not so-called government. We were just probably what they might call, they're just having fun, but curfew is curfew, that kind of thing. So we were hauled out to the military camp. They held us there for a night. They did not put us in jail. They just held us in the camp for overnight until the morning. And then they let us go.
And
which gave us a chance to sober up.
Oh, okay. Slept it off.
Yeah.
How about repeat offenders? Was there 3 strikes, 4 strikes? How was this?
No, there was no
as far
such
as-
thing, because if you're arrested, you're arrested, and what they call it now, if you were known to be a government against the government or against what's going on, they arrest you and put you in jail for a long time. I know a teacher there. His wife owned a convenience store. Had a business of her own, and he was a teacher in some school. He was very radical. So one day he gets a knock on his door, and they said, "Mr. So-and-so, could you please come in? We would like to talk to you." And that was the last the wife saw of him. Until maybe about 6 to 8 months. Then he showed up again. But at that point, he won't say any word anymore. He was silenced. The government just silenced him. They tortured him, all that stuff. His wife went out of business. They had to sell everything just to survive. They basically cleaned them up.
Was it a common occurrence for example, if an individual family member was arrested and the community, many people knew it, how did this affect the rest of the family of that individual who was arrested?
Well, if the family is not, if it was probably a brother or sister, this family will still survive. Of course, you worry about your loved one. But if it was the father, who's basically the bread earner of the family, then we got a problem. Just like the one I told you, the teacher, for instance. They never heard from him again. He lost his job. He doesn't have. He can't work in any place anymore. So he had to sell everything in order to survive. The wife went out of business. Everything else. Yeah. So.
Wow. And how long did martial law last officially?
It started in 1972, and then I believe I was already here in the country when Marcos was finally thrown out. I don't know what year that was, but I think it was if I'm not mistaken, it was 1980 something. Yeah, I think it was 1980 because my daughter was born. I'm not sure about the year, but it lasted for a while. It lasted for a while.
And it was said that common Filipino citizen was forbidden to have guns or own guns at this time, being that it's martial law, military rule.
Yeah.
That would make sense that a government would have a
Oh, yeah.
policy
Oh, yeah,
of
definitely.
no guns,
Definitely.
strict gun control.
Yeah. Oh,
What was
yeah.
that like?
I don't know because I didn't own a gun.
Right.
Yeah, I have no idea, but I'm sure some people who own guns would probably stash it away.
Right. And just last question, wrap this up. Could martial law happen again in the Philippines, or how about anywhere else, in particularly the United States?
I won't put it past anybody who wants to be in power, no matter how big or how small the country is. I wouldn't put it past somebody who really has the temerity to go after power. So it could happen anywhere else. I mean, the Philippines was a small country, but again, it's rife with corruption. Even to this day, it is rife with corruption. And I wouldn't be surprised if something like that happens again. But you never know.
Today, 2016, the United States election year, a lot of divide and conquer, divisive issues. There's been violence at
Oh, yeah.
political rallies,
Yeah.
both left and right, all over the place. And could one looking at this, the big picture of what's going on 2016 and the violence and groups, radical groups, no matter what end of the political spectrum, could it be possible that this could happen today?
It could. It could very well happen. It could very well happen. And like I said, I mean, anybody who is in power or anybody who wants to have power, whoever that person may be, if he gets a hold of the right people, he gets a hold of, say, a good backing from, say, for example, the military and all that stuff, it could happen. But in a country like the United States, the country is so big and the people are so diverse, that's probably going to be a difficult one to do. But you never know.
Right. Well, Mr. Art Reyes, thank you so much for sharing your story and experience.
I hope that sheds a light of what happened in the Philippines. I've been away from the country for 39 years now, or 40 years now. So I left before martial law was lifted. So yeah,
Right.
yeah, everything's fine now.
Right.
They're back in democracy now, but still a lot of corruption goes on, especially in the smaller countries.
Right.
Yeah.
All right.
That's
Well,
it.
thank you once again. I
You're
really
welcome.
do appreciate
You're
it.
welcome.
And it's great to let the listeners know about your story and your experience. And you've been great. And thanks again.
You're welcome.
All right.